December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. As Japanese bombs fell on American warships, tearing apart the Pacific Fleet and killing over 2,400 Americans, a young Japanese American named Daniel Inouye stood on a hill overlooking the harbor. He watched the smoke rise, watched his country bleed, and made a decision that would define his life. He would fight for America, the country that was about to declare his people the enemy. Within months, 120,000 Japanese Americans would be rounded up and imprisoned in internment camps scattered across America's most desolate regions. Their crime, their ancestry, their punishment, loss of homes, businesses, freedom, dignity, everything they'd built in America, taken away by Executive Order 9066. But something remarkable happened in those camps, something that would shock military commanders, confound racist politicians, and ultimately prove that loyalty isn't determined by the shape of your eyes or the color of your skin. Young men behind barbed wire began volunteering to fight for the country that had imprisoned their families. This is the story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in American military history. The story of men who fought two wars simultaneously, one against Axis enemies in Europe, another against prejudice at home. The story of soldiers who proved their loyalty not through words but through blood. Before we discover how these imprisoned Americans became heroes, tell us where you're watching from. The 442nd story resonates globally because it proves that courage and loyalty transcend race, that character is revealed not in comfort, but in crisis. February 19, 1942. President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the removal of anyone deemed a threat to national security from military areas. The order didn't mention Japanese Americans specifically, but everyone knew who it targeted. Fred Shiosaki was 15 years old, living in Spokane, Washington. His family had owned a successful restaurant for 20 years. His father had immigrated legally, worked brutally hard, sent Fred and his siblings to American schools. They were Americans in every way except one: they looked like the enemy. "We had 2 weeks," Fred recalled decades later. 2 weeks to sell everything we owned. Our house, our restaurant, our car, everything. People knew we were desperate. They offered pennies on the dollar. We lost everything our parents had built over 2 decades. The Shiosaki family, along with thousands of others, was sent to Minidoka War Relocation Center in Idaho. Barracks built on desert wasteland, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Armed soldiers watching American citizens whose only crime was their ancestry. The conditions were harsh. Families crammed into single rooms with thin walls and no privacy. Communal bathrooms with no partitions. Dust storms that turned the air brown and coated everything in grit. Winter temperatures that dropped below zero with inadequate heating. Summer heat that made the tar paper barracks feel like ovens. "We were American citizens," Fred said. "My parents had lived here for decades. My siblings and I were born here, but suddenly we were prisoners. The guards had machine guns pointed inward, not outward. They weren't protecting us. They were guarding us." In Hawaii, things were different but equally complex. Daniel Inouye, son of Japanese immigrants, watched as some Japanese Americans were arrested immediately after Pearl Harbor. But Hawaii's economy depended too heavily on Japanese American labor to imprison everyone. Still, suspicion and hatred surrounded them. Inouye was a senior in high school, studying to become a doctor. After Pearl Harbor, he volunteered for civil defense, providing medical aid to wounded sailors and civilians. He wanted to enlist, to fight for America. But Japanese Americans weren't allowed to serve. They were classified as enemy aliens, 4C, unsuitable for military service. The irony was crushing. American citizens, desperate to prove their loyalty, forbidden from defending their country. January 1943. The War Department made a stunning announcement. They would form an all-Japanese American combat unit. Men from the internment camps and from Hawaii would be allowed to volunteer for military service. The decision was purely practical, not humanitarian. America needed soldiers. The war in Europe was consuming men faster than they could be trained, and military intelligence had determined that Japanese Americans, contrary to racist assumptions, were overwhelmingly loyal to the United States. But there was a catch. Volunteers would have to answer a loyalty questionnaire. Two questions became infamous, questions 27 and 28. Question 27 asked if they were willing to serve in combat duty wherever ordered. Question 28 asked if they would swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor. The questions were offensive on multiple levels. Japanese Americans born in the United States had never owed allegiance to Japan. The questions assumed disloyalty based on race, and men were being asked to volunteer from behind barbed wire, their families still imprisoned, their property confiscated. They wanted us to fight for freedom while our parents sat in camps, Fred Shiosaki explained. They wanted us to prove our loyalty by dying for a country that had declared us disloyal without evidence. It was insulting, it was humiliating, and yet we volunteered. The military expected maybe 3,000 volunteers. They got over 10,000 from Hawaii alone. From the mainland camps, where bitterness ran deeper, thousands more volunteered. Young men choosing to fight for a country that had stripped them of their rights. Why did they volunteer? The answers varied. Some wanted to prove their loyalty. Some wanted to fight fascism, the same ideology that had imprisoned them. Some wanted to honor their parents, who despite everything still believed in America. Some simply wanted out of the camps, even if the exit was through a battlefield. Daniel Inouye volunteered immediately. "I was angry," he later said. "Angry at Japan for attacking us, angry at my own government for imprisoning my people. But I loved my country. I wanted to prove we were Americans, not by talking, but by fighting." The volunteers were sent to Camp Shelby, Mississippi for training. Most had never been to the Deep South. They arrived to find a different kind of prejudice than they'd known in the West. Jim Crow segregation, whites-only facilities, racial hatred codified into law. But something unexpected happened. The Japanese American soldiers, victims of racism themselves, were appalled by how Black Americans were treated. Some refused to patronize segregated businesses. Stories spread of 442nd soldiers defending Black soldiers from racist attacks. Two groups America treated as second-class citizens finding common ground in shared injustice. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was officially activated on February 1, 1943. Its motto, chosen by the soldiers themselves, was "Go for broke," a Hawaiian gambling term meaning to risk everything on a single bet. These men were betting their lives that they could prove their loyalty through courage. Training at Camp Shelby was brutal. The Army didn't coddle them. If anything, expectations were higher. These soldiers would have to be better than everyone else, just to be considered equal. Every mistake would be attributed to their race. Every failure would confirm racist assumptions. Colonel Charles Pence, the 442nd's first commander, was a West Point graduate with no experience with Japanese Americans. He'd accepted the command reluctantly, uncertain if these men could be trusted in combat. Within weeks, his opinion transformed completely. "These soldiers are the finest I've ever commanded," Pence reported to his superiors. "Their discipline is exceptional. Their motivation is unmatched. They train harder, follow orders more precisely, and show more unit cohesion than any regiment I've seen. If we can't trust these men in combat, we can't trust anyone." The physical training was relentless. Long marches in Mississippi heat, weapons training with live ammunition, tactical exercises that simulated combat conditions. The soldiers pushed themselves beyond normal limits, knowing they represented not just themselves, but their families, their communities, their entire race. But training couldn't prepare them for what they'd face. Not just enemy fire, but the prejudice of fellow Americans. When the 442nd shipped out to Europe in May 1944, many white soldiers viewed them with suspicion. Some refused to share foxholes with Japs. Some openly questioned whether they'd fight or defect to the enemy. The 442nd would answer those questions in blood. June 1944. While the D-Day invasion seized headlines, the 442nd landed in Italy as part of the Fifth Army. Their first combat assignment was in the Inouye beachhead, where Allied forces had been bogged down for months against fierce German resistance. The veterans of Inouye, hardened by months of combat, watched the Japanese-American soldiers arrive with skepticism. "Here come the Buddha heads," some muttered, using a derogatory term. "Let's see if they can actually fight." The 442nd's first major engagement came near Suvareto, Italy, on June 26, 1944. Company F was pinned down by German machine gun positions in hills overlooking the town. The Germans had perfect fields of fire. Any advance seemed suicidal. Staff Sergeant Kazuo Masuda volunteered to lead a small team to flank the German positions. Moving through dense brush under heavy fire, Masuda's team crawled within grenade range of the German bunkers. What happened next shocked the watching American forces. Masuda and his men charged the German positions in broad daylight, throwing grenades and firing from the hip. It was tactically reckless, the kind of aggressive action that either wins medals or gets everyone killed. The German machine guns fell silent. Masuda's team had destroyed 3 positions, killing 15 Germans and capturing 4. The cost was severe. 2 men from Masuda's team were killed. Masuda himself was wounded but refused evacuation until the objective was secured. When medics finally carried him back, the white soldiers who'd questioned Japanese-American courage were silent. "They fight like demons," one sergeant from a Texas unit reported. "Craziest damn thing I ever saw. They charged machine guns like they didn't care if they died." But it wasn't recklessness. It was calculation born of desperation. These soldiers knew they couldn't just fight well. They had to fight better than everyone else. Every battle was a referendum on Japanese-American loyalty. Every hesitation would be attributed to cowardice or disloyalty. So they attacked when others defended, advanced when others held, took casualties that white units might not have accepted. The statistics from Italy tell the story. In its first 3 months of combat, the 442nd suffered a 314% casualty rate, meaning the unit had to be replenished more than 3 times over. They were bleeding themselves white, proving their loyalty. But the proof was undeniable. By August 1944, the 442nd had liberated numerous Italian towns, captured hundreds of German prisoners, and earned the respect of every unit they fought alongside. The jokes about Buddha heads stopped. Now, when veterans saw the 442nd patch, a shield bearing a torch of liberty and the motto, "Go for broke," they knew they were looking at real soldiers. October 1944. The Vosges Mountains, France. The 442nd, now attached to the 36th Infantry Division, was ordered into some of the war's most brutal terrain. The Vosges were heavily forested mountains, where visibility dropped to meters, where German defenders held every ridgeline, where the rain never seemed to stop. The 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, a Texas unit nicknamed the Lost Battalion, had pushed too far ahead and was surrounded by German forces. Over 200 men were trapped, cut off from supplies, taking casualties, running out of ammunition. Multiple rescue attempts had failed with heavy losses. The 442nd was ordered to break through and rescue them. The soldiers knew what it meant. The terrain favored defenders. German forces were dug in with machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The rescue would cost lives, many lives. Some officers questioned the order. Was it worth sacrificing hundreds to save 200? But the 442nd's leadership knew this was more than a military objective. This was a test. If Japanese Americans failed to rescue white Texans, critics would claim they lacked courage. If they succeeded at terrible cost, they'd prove their loyalty beyond question. The attack began on October 27, 1944. The 402nd advanced through forests so thick that visibility was measured in feet. German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions. Mortars rained down. The trees themselves became weapons, shell fragments and splinters tearing through the ranks. The advance was measured in yards per day. Every 100 meters cost lives. The weather turned freezing, rain mixing with snow. Soldiers fought in mud that sucked at their boots, slept in foxholes filled with icy water, ate cold rations because fires drew enemy artillery. Private Barney Hajiro's squad encountered a German roadblock on the second day. Machine gun fire killed his squad leader and pinned down the survivors. Hajiro, a quiet Hawaiian who rarely spoke, did something that would earn him the Medal of Honor. He charged the German position alone. Running through machine gun fire, Hajiro closed to within yards of the German bunker and threw grenades. The machine gun fell silent. Before German soldiers could respond, Hajiro destroyed a second position with rifle grenades. His squad advanced through the gap he'd created. 2 days later, Hajiro repeated the feat, destroying 2 more machine gun positions single-handedly while wounded. His actions were typical of the 442nd's approach, individual courage bordering on suicidal, driven by desperate need to prove themselves. By October 30th, the 442nd had penetrated 5 miles through supposedly impenetrable German defenses. The cost was staggering. Companies that had started with 180 men were down to 40 or 50. Some platoons had no officers left, led by sergeants or even corporals. Medical supplies ran low, ammunition was rationed. Still, they advanced. On October 30th, elements of the 442nd broke through to the Lost Battalion. The trapped Texans, who'd been surrounded for a week, starving and nearly out of ammunition, stared in disbelief at their rescuers. Japanese-American soldiers, some barely 5 feet tall, exhausted, wounded but victorious. 201 men of the Lost Battalion were saved. The 442nd suffered over 800 casualties, more than 4 times the number rescued. Every officer in one battalion was killed or wounded. Some companies were reduced to 20 or 30 men. Years later, a reporter asked a 442nd veteran if the rescue was worth the cost. The veteran thought for a long moment before answering. "We didn't have a choice. We had to prove we were loyal Americans. We proved it by dying like Americans." The Vosges campaign broke the 442nd. Of the 3,000 men who entered the mountains, fewer than 800 walked out unscathed. The unit had to be pulled from the line and rebuilt with replacements from the States. But something had changed. The 442nd was no longer questioned. They'd proven themselves in the most brutal way possible, through blood and sacrifice. White soldiers who'd fought alongside them spread the word. These Japanese-American kids were real warriors. The recognition came with bitter irony. While the 442nd bled in France, their families remained imprisoned in camps back home. Soldiers received letters from parents asking when they'd be released, children asking when daddy would bring them home from behind the barbed wire. Some soldiers received worse news. Private First Class Sadao Munemori learned his family had been moved from one camp to another, losing what little stability they'd found. Staff Sergeant Kazuo Masuda, who'd led the heroic charge at Suvareto, received word that his sister had been denied permission to leave the camp to attend college. The psychological toll was immense. These men were fighting for a country that imprisoned their families. Some questioned whether the sacrifice was worth it. Some wondered if proving loyalty would actually change anything, or if white America would always see them as Japanese first, Americans second. Daniel Inouye, now a lieutenant in the 442nd, wrote to his parents, "We fight not for glory or recognition, but for the simple right to be treated as Americans. Every German we kill, every mile we advance, we do it to prove that our loyalty is beyond question. I pray it will be enough." The 442nd returned to combat in March 1945, now fighting in northern Italy. The German Gothic Line was the last major defensive position before the Po Valley and the heart of northern Italy. German commanders had spent months fortifying the position, creating bunkers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire that made assault nearly impossible. The 442nd was assigned to break through at a section considered impenetrable. German forces held the high ground with perfect observation. Every approach was covered by machine guns and artillery. Previous attacks had failed with catastrophic casualties. April 5, 1945. The 442nd launched its assault on the Gothic Line. The attack began before dawn, with soldiers climbing steep slopes under darkness. German flares illuminated the mountainside, turning night into day and exposing the attackers to withering fire. Lieutenant Daniel Inouye led his platoon up a ridge called Colle Musatello. German machine guns opened fire from concealed bunkers. Men fell around him, but Inouye kept climbing, leading by example. At the crest of the ridge, Inouye spotted 3 German machine gun bunkers covering the approach. His platoon was pinned down, taking casualties. Without these bunkers eliminated, the attack would fail. Inouye made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He charged the first bunker alone, throwing grenades while firing his Thompson submachine gun. The bunker fell silent. He moved to the second bunker, repeating the tactic. German soldiers inside surrendered. At the third bunker, Inouye pulled the pin on a grenade and raised his arm to throw. A German soldier inside fired a rifle grenade, a projectile designed to penetrate armor. The grenade struck Inouye's right arm at point-blank range, nearly severing it. What happened next became legendary in the 442nd. Inouye, his right arm useless and bleeding, pried the live grenade from his dead hand with his left hand and threw it into the bunker. The explosion silenced the German position. But Inouye wasn't finished. A German soldier emerged from the bunker firing. Inouye, one-armed and bleeding heavily, shot him with his Thompson held in his left hand. Another German appeared. Inouye shot him too. Then he collapsed, blood loss finally overwhelming him. His platoon secured the position and evacuated him. Medics gave him morphine and plasma, trying to stabilize him for the long journey to a field hospital. Inouye's shattered arm had to be amputated. His dreams of becoming a surgeon were finished, but he'd completed the mission. Inouye's actions that day earned him the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest decoration. 55 years later, in 2000, that award was upgraded to the Medal of Honor after a review determined that racial prejudice had prevented Japanese-American soldiers from receiving the nation's highest award during the war. The 442nd's assault on the Gothic Line succeeded where others had failed. They broke through German defenses and opened the way for the final Allied advance into northern Italy. The cost, as always, was severe. The unit suffered another 600 casualties in 2 weeks of fighting. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team had become the most decorated unit in American military history relative to its size and length of service. The numbers tell a story of extraordinary courage. 21 Medals of Honor, though most were awarded decades later. 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 1 Distinguished Service Medal, 560 Silver Stars, 22 Legion of Merit Medals, 15 Soldiers Medals, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 9,486 Purple Hearts. The unit had a casualty rate of 314%, meaning it had to be completely rebuilt more than 3 times. Over 800 men were killed in action. Thousands more were wounded, many permanently disabled. When the 442nd returned to the United States in 1946, they received a hero's welcome in Washington, D.C. President Harry Truman, who had desegregated the military, personally reviewed them on the White House lawn. "You fought not only the enemy," Truman told the assembled soldiers, "but you fought prejudice, and you have won. Keep up that fight, and we will continue to win, to make this great republic stand for just what the Constitution says it stands for, the welfare of all the people, all the time." The words were powerful. The reality was more complicated. The 442nd veterans returned home to find that many Americans still viewed them with suspicion. The war was over, but prejudice wasn't defeated so easily. Fred Shiosaki returned to Spokane to find his family's restaurant sold, their home occupied by others, their savings gone. His parents, released from Minidoka, were starting over from nothing in their 50s. "I'd been shot 3 times in Europe," Fred recalled. "I had a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, but when I tried to buy a house, banks wouldn't give me a loan. When I applied for jobs, employers said they weren't hiring Japs. I'd fought for this country, bled for it, and I still wasn't treated like a real American." Daniel Inouye faced similar challenges. His dream of becoming a surgeon was gone with his right arm. He decided to study law instead, but law schools were reluctant to admit a one-armed Japanese-American veteran. He was finally accepted at George Washington University. Some 442nd veterans fared better. In Hawaii, where Japanese Americans were a larger part of the population, returning soldiers were celebrated as heroes. Many went on to successful careers in business and politics, but on the mainland, discrimination persisted. The most bitter irony was that the families who'd been imprisoned were given no apology and minimal compensation. The government offered $25 per day for each day of internment, an insulting sum that came nowhere close to covering the losses. Most families had lost everything: homes, businesses, savings, careers, years of their lives. Yet the 442nd veterans didn't become bitter. Instead, they channeled their experience into fighting for civil rights. They'd proven loyalty through blood. Now they'd fight for equality through law and politics. Daniel Inouye was elected to Hawaii's Territorial House of Representatives in 1954, then to the U.S. House of Representatives when Hawaii became a state in 1959, and finally to the U.S. Senate in 1963, where he served for 49 years until his death in 2012. He became one of America's most respected senators, chairing powerful committees and earning trust from colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Other 442nd veterans followed similar paths. Spark Matsunaga served in the U.S. Senate. Norman Mineta served in Congress and became the first Asian American cabinet member, serving as Secretary of Transportation. Barney Hajiro, the quiet Hawaiian who'd charged German machine guns, returned to Hawaii and lived a modest life, his Medal of Honor not awarded until 2000. Fred Shiosaki eventually built a successful life in Spokane, though it took years of struggle. He rarely spoke about the war until late in life, the memories too painful, the sense of injustice too fresh. For decades, the 442nd's story was largely forgotten outside Japanese-American communities. The soldiers themselves rarely talked about their service. Many felt conflicted about their wartime experience, proud of their courage, but bitter about the prejudice that necessitated such extraordinary proof. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, formally apologizing for the internment of Japanese Americans and providing reparations of $20,000 to each surviving internee. It was a small gesture 46 years late, but it acknowledged the injustice. The act's passage was influenced by Japanese American veterans, including 442nd members, who'd become prominent in politics and business. They'd fought for decades, not just for themselves, but for all Japanese Americans, using their military service as proof of loyalty that couldn't be questioned. In the 1990s, the military began reviewing Medal of Honor recommendations from World War II after studies showed that racial minorities had been systematically denied the nation's highest award. The review found that 21 Asian Americans, most from the 442nd, deserved the Medal of Honor but had received lesser awards due to racial prejudice. On June 21, 2000, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 21 Asian American veterans, 20 of them from the 442nd. Only 7 were still alive to receive it in person. The others were honored posthumously, their families accepting the medals. Daniel Inouye was among the recipients. Standing before the president, the 75-year-old senator who'd charged German bunkers with one arm remembered his fallen comrades. "We were young men who knew that we might not survive," Inouye said. "But we also knew that if we didn't fight, If we didn't prove our loyalty, our families would remain prisoners, and future generations would be marked as disloyal. We fought for them. This medal honors not just us, but every Japanese American who suffered during the war. The 442nd story gained wider recognition in the 21st century through documentaries, books, and educational programs. Schools began teaching about the unit, using it as an example of courage in the face of injustice. What lessons does the 442nd offer? First, that loyalty cannot be determined by appearance or ancestry. The most loyal Americans are often those who've had to fight hardest for acceptance. Second, that courage is most meaningful when the cause is uncertain. The 442nd soldiers didn't fight knowing they'd be vindicated. They fought despite having every reason to be bitter. Third, that democracy requires constant vigilance. The internment happened because fear and prejudice overwhelmed constitutional protections. It took decades to acknowledge the injustice and provide even minimal compensation. Fourth, that individual actions matter. Each 442nd soldier who charged an enemy position, each one who volunteered from behind barbed wire, contributed to changing American attitudes about race and loyalty. Fred Shiosaki lived until 2021, passing away at age 94. In his final years, he spoke at schools and community groups, sharing the 442nd's story with new generations. "We didn't fight for recognition," he told audiences. "We fought because it was the right thing to do. We were Americans, and Americans defend their country, even when their country has wronged them. That's what citizenship means. Not just enjoying privileges, but accepting responsibilities even when it's hard." The 402nd's combat record has never been equaled for a unit of its size. But perhaps their greater achievement was proving that American identity transcends race. They forced the nation to confront its own prejudices by demonstrating courage beyond question. In 2010, the 442nd and the 100th Infantry Battalion, which fought alongside them, were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. President Barack Obama, America's first non-white president, presented the medal. "The story of the 442nd is the story of America at its best and worst," Obama said. "These men were imprisoned by their own government because of their race. Yet they volunteered to fight for that government. They suffered casualties that would have broken most units. They earned more decorations for valor than any unit their size. They proved through sacrifice that being American isn't about what you look like. It's about what you believe and what you're willing to do for those beliefs." Today, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team is remembered as one of the most remarkable units in military history. Their story appears in textbooks, documentaries, and museums. The Go for Broke National Education Center in Los Angeles preserves their legacy and teaches new generations about their service. But the most important legacy isn't awards or recognition. It's the principle they established through blood, that American identity is defined by character and courage, not by race or ancestry. That principle was won on Italian mountainsides and French forests, paid for with thousands of casualties, earned by young men who chose loyalty over bitterness. Daniel Inouye, before his death in 2012, was asked if the sacrifice was worth it. The senator, who'd given his arm and nearly his life, who'd spent decades fighting for justice, thought carefully before answering. "We had no choice," he said finally. "Our families were in prison. Our community was marked as disloyal. The only way to change that was to prove our loyalty beyond any possible doubt. So we fought. We died. We bled. And eventually we won. Not just the war, but something more important. Recognition as true Americans. Was it worth it? Ask my grandchildren. Ask the generations who grew up without being imprisoned because of their ancestry. For them, yes, it was worth it." The 442nd Regimental Combat Team went to war as second-class citizens and came home as American heroes. Their story proves that the highest form of patriotism isn't blind loyalty, but fighting for your country even when your country has failed you. They bet everything, went for broke, and proved that courage and loyalty transcend race. In a barn in Bavaria, James Harper saw children first and enemies second, choosing mercy over war. The 442nd saw America first and injustice second, choosing loyalty over bitterness. Both stories prove the same truth, that humanity's highest calling is choosing what's right over what's easy, and that individual courage can change history. The thunder of 8 synchronized machine guns helped win a war. The courage of Japanese-American soldiers fighting from behind barbed wire helped win something greater: justice. Both victories required ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Both prove that individual actions matter, that choosing compassion and loyalty over hatred and bitterness can change the world. The 442nd's motto was, "Go for broke." They risked everything on the bet that proving loyalty through sacrifice would change American attitudes about race. They won that bet, paid for in blood, vindicated by time, honored by history. Their legacy endures not in medals or monuments, but in the simple truth they established: that American identity transcends ancestry, that courage speaks louder than prejudice, and that loyalty proven through sacrifice cannot be questioned.